I am Harrison, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful logistics tycoon, I thought my wealth shielded us from toxicity, but I was entirely wrong. Last Tuesday, I picked up my 8-year-old son Toby from baseball practice. As we approached our estate, Toby grabbed my arm and whispered that the shadow men were inside. I simply turned off the headlights parked down the street and watched. That night, I discovered a betrayal so dark, it forced me to freeze every family account and call my lawyers. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from the people you trusted most. Growing up poor in rural Texas meant fighting for survival. But inside our sprawling mansion, with its manicured lawns and high-security walls, a different kind of danger permeated every single corner. The heavy Texas heat was still clinging to the asphalt as I steered my car through the winding, silent roads of our gated community. It was a Tuesday evening. Toby was sitting in the passenger seat, quietly tracing the stitching on his leather baseball glove. He is a highly observant boy, one who came into my life late and became my absolute center of gravity. I am a man of routines and rigid schedules. I spent 4 decades building a massive supply chain empire from absolutely nothing. I know exactly how things move, how variables connect, and how to spot a fatal break in any chain. Everything in my life was supposed to be predictable. My wife of 40 years was waiting for us at home. Dinner was supposed to be on the table. But as I flipped the turn signal to enter our long, oak-lined driveway, Toby suddenly reached out. His small, cold hand gripped my wrist with terrifying strength. He did not look at me. His eyes were fixed completely straight ahead on the dark silhouette of our massive house. He whispered in a voice so low and steady that it made my blood run entirely cold. He told me not to go in. He said the men in the shadows were waiting. I did not ask him what he meant. I did not dismiss it as a childish imagination or a trick of the evening light. When you spend your entire life navigating cutthroat business deals and corporate espionage, you learn to trust the raw instinct of fear. I immediately turned off the headlights. I killed the engine and let the car roll silently past our driveway, parking in the deep shadows of a large weeping willow tree 2 blocks down the street. I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned to my son, asking him very calmly what exactly he saw. Toby swallowed hard and pointed a shaking finger toward the iron gates of our estate. He told me they had been there before when I was away on business trips. He said they always came through the side gate, and they never made a sound. My heart began to hammer heavily against my ribs. I rolled down the window just a fraction to let the night air in. We sat in the absolute darkness. The silence of the wealthy neighborhood was deafening. 10 minutes passed. I was almost ready to convince myself that Toby was just overtired from practice. And then a vehicle slowly turned the corner. It was a dark, unmarked utility van. It drove with its headlights completely off, creeping along the curb like a silent predator in the night. It stopped exactly in front of my private security gate. I held my breath, placing a reassuring hand on Toby's shoulder. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle. They were dressed entirely in black, wearing dark caps and heavy work boots. They did not look around nervously like common thieves. They moved with the terrifying precision of people who knew exactly what they were doing. I watched through the windshield as one of the men walked directly to the digital keypad on the stone security pillar. He did not hesitate. He did not pull out a piece of paper to check a number. He raised his gloved hand and punched in a 6-digit code. The heavy iron gates swung open with a soft mechanical hum. My stomach plummeted into a bottomless pit. That code was not a generic entry number. It was not the temporary code for the landscapers or the pool maintenance crew. It was the master override code, a highly encrypted sequence of numbers that bypassed the silent alarms and the motion sensors. Only 2 people in the entire world knew that specific sequence: me and my wife. The mother of the boy sitting terrified beside me. My analytical mind began to race violently, connecting dots that I had blindly ignored for months. The men walked up the long driveway and disappeared around the back of the house, heading directly toward the service entrance. Toby gripped my sleeve tighter. He asked me if we should call the police right now. I looked at my young son and shook my head slowly. I told him we had to wait and observe. In the logistics business, you never interrupt an operation until you know exactly what cargo is being moved and who the final recipient is. If I called the police right now, these men would simply claim they were hired contractors, and the person inside who gave them the code would deny everything. I needed to see exactly what they were doing in my home. We waited in the suffocating heat of the car for 15 minutes. Every single second felt like a grueling eternity. I calculated the layout of my house in my head. 15 minutes was enough time to empty the wall safe in my primary study. It was enough time to plant hidden listening devices. It was enough time to do something unspeakable. Finally, the shadows re-emerged from the side of the house. But they were not carrying bags of cash jewelry or stolen artwork. They were carrying something much more disturbing. Each man was lugging a heavy industrial steel canister. They walked carefully, keeping the heavy metal containers perfectly upright. They loaded the canisters into the back of the unmarked van with extreme caution. I strained my eyes through the darkness, trying to identify the warning labels on the metal cylinders. They looked exactly like pressurized chemical tanks used in industrial manufacturing. My mind kicked into overdrive. Why would someone sneak into my house using my private code just to leave with heavy chemical canisters? I replayed the last 20 minutes in my head with absolute clarity. When the men first stepped out of the van, they were carrying those same steel canisters. They had brought them inside full, and now they were leaving with empty ones. They had swapped them. They had deposited something highly volatile or toxic inside the service room of my house. The service room that connects directly to the central ventilation and water filtration systems of the entire mansion. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the air from my lungs. My wife was inside that house right now. Or at least she was supposed to be. Was she an unknowing victim in this? Or was she the orchestrator? The men closed the back doors of the van silently. They climbed into the front seats and drove away, still operating without headlights, until they reached the main boulevard. I watched the red taillights disappear into the distance. The street returned to its eerie quiet, but my world had been completely shattered. I did not start the car immediately. I needed to lock my raging emotions in a mental vault. I am not a man who panics. I am a man who builds complex systems and ruthlessly destroys obstacles. Someone was trying to physically harm me. Someone was trying to harm my son. And the only logical conclusion was that the threat was coming from inside my own marriage. I picked up my cell phone. I pulled up my wife's contact. I sent her a simple text message saying we were running late at the baseball field and would be home in an hour. Her reply came almost instantly. She said she was making my favorite dinner and could not wait for us to get back. The tone was completely normal, perfectly affectionate. It was the plausible lie of a woman who thought her husband was a clueless, trusting old fool. She did not know that I was sitting 2 blocks away watching the house. She did not know that my 8-year-old son had just saved both of our lives. I looked at Toby. I told him he was a very brave boy and promised him that no one was ever going to hurt us. I started the engine, but I did not drive toward the house. Instead, I turned the wheel in the opposite direction, heading toward a discreet downtown hotel. I needed a secure base of operations. I needed to hire the most ruthless private investigators and forensic auditors in the state of Texas. I was going to tear my own life apart, brick by brick, to find out exactly what was inside those steel canisters, and exactly why the woman I loved had given the shadow men the keys to our castle. The war had just begun, and I was going to finish it. 2 days after my son's $300,000 wedding, the restaurant manager called me. He said we rechecked the security camera footage. "You need to see this yourself. Please come alone." And whatever you do, do not tell your wife. If you are just starting to watch this story, now take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen in my own family. If you are connecting with my story, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me. My name is Harrison. I am 70 years old, and I live in Denver, Colorado. For 4 decades, I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building a commercial real estate firm from the absolute ground up. I started with nothing but a cheap suit and a relentless drive to succeed. Today, my company is highly successful, and I thought the wealth I had accumulated would serve as a permanent shield around my family. I thought it would guarantee peace, security, and happiness. I was entirely wrong. Just 48 hours before that chilling phone call, I had walked my family through what was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. I paid for a lavish, picture-perfect wedding for my 32-year-old son, Derek. He had just married Monica, a 29-year-old woman who presented herself to the world as an elegant, flawless bride from a highly respectable background. My wife of 40 years, Cynthia, stood by my side throughout the entire ceremony. She wore a custom gown, weeping what I believed were genuine tears of joy, playing the role of the proud, loving mother to absolute perfection. We were, to anyone looking from the outside, the ultimate American success story. It was Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my home office, sipping a cup of black coffee, enjoying the rare golden quiet that follows a massive weekend event. Cynthia had left early for a charity luncheon downtown. The house was empty and completely silent. Then my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of the upscale venue where we had hosted the wedding reception. I answered, expecting a routine question about a final billing detail or a left-behind coat. Instead, I heard the voice of Martin, the general manager. He did not offer any polite greetings. His voice was tight, anxious, and trembling with an uncomfortable urgency. He told me they were doing a routine security audit of the back corridor cameras from Saturday night. He said he had found something. He told me I needed to come down immediately, but I had to come alone, and I absolutely could not mention a word of this to Cynthia. I hung up the phone and sat frozen in my leather chair for a long moment. I am a man of logic and reason. I have spent my entire adult life analyzing complex contracts, zoning laws, and financial statements. I know how to calculate risk. But Martin's terrified tone defied all of my logic. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I grabbed my keys, walked out to the garage, and got into my vehicle. The drive through the crisp Denver morning felt incredibly surreal. The sky was a bright, piercing blue, the mountains looming in the distance, but all I could feel was a suffocating sense of dread. What could a security camera possibly have captured at a joyous family wedding that would make a seasoned hospitality manager sound so completely rattled? I pulled into the restaurant's private parking lot. It was closed to the public on Tuesdays, rendering the massive building eerily desolate. The contrast between the vibrant, music-filled celebrations from just 2 nights ago and the dead, hollow quiet of today was deeply unsettling. Martin was waiting for me at the side entrance. He looked pale and deeply uncomfortable. He unlocked the heavy glass doors and led me through the empty dining room without saying a single word. Our footsteps echoed loudly against the hardwood floors. He swiped a keycard and guided me into a cramped, windowless security office in the back of the building. The room smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Several large monitors glowed brightly against the dark walls. Martin sat down at the computer console. He cleared his throat nervously and told me he stumbled upon this footage by accident while checking a camera that had supposedly malfunctioned. He clicked his mouse, pulling up a specific timestamp from Saturday night, right in the middle of the reception. The screen displayed a black and white view of a secluded service corridor near the kitchen loading docks. It was a blind spot, an area where guests would never accidentally wander. 2 figures walked into the frame. It was Cynthia and Monica. Even in the grainy security footage, I could clearly see my wife in her expensive evening gown, and my new daughter-in-law in her immaculate white wedding dress. But there was no joy in their posture. They were not smiling. They were not sharing a tender moment away from the crowd. Monica's body language was aggressively dominant. She stepped close to my wife, cornering Cynthia against the cinder block wall. They exchanged words I could not hear, but the hostility radiating from Monica was undeniable. And then the unthinkable happened right before my eyes. Monica raised her hand and slapped Cynthia hard across the face. The sheer force of the blow snapped my wife's head to the side. I gasped aloud in the small security room, my hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. I waited for Cynthia to explode in anger. My wife was a fiercely proud, untouchable matriarch who commanded respect from everyone she met. I fully expected her to strike back, to scream, to tear the young woman apart. But Cynthia did not fight back. She did not even raise her hand to defend herself. Instead, she cowered. Her shoulders slumped in total submission. With trembling hands, Cynthia reached into her designer evening bag. She pulled out a thick, heavy envelope that clearly contained a massive amount of cash and shoved it frantically into Monica's waiting hands. But that was not all. Cynthia reached into her bag one more time. She pulled out a small dark glass vial and handed it over. Monica snatched the vial, holding it up to the light to inspect it. Then the new bride smirked, raised her hand, and patronizingly patted my wife on the cheek, treating the woman I had loved for 40 years like a pathetic, disobedient child. Monica turned and walked casually back toward the reception, leaving Cynthia alone in the hallway, leaning against the wall, utterly defeated. The video ended. The monitor froze on Cynthia's slumped figure. I forgot how to breathe. The air in the tiny office felt thick and suffocating. My 40-year marriage, my son's new life, the entire foundation of my family, had just fractured into a million jagged, irrecoverable pieces right in front of my eyes. Martin sat beside me in heavy silence, looking down at his shoes, giving me the space to process the absolute nightmare I had just witnessed. I forced my lungs to draw in a deep breath. The initial shock was rapidly burning away, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifying clarity. I turned to Martin. My voice was steady and completely devoid of emotion. I asked him to copy the video file to a portable drive and to permanently delete it from his servers. I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from my money clip and placed it on his desk, buying his absolute silence. I took the drive, slipped it into my pocket, and walked out of the building. I stepped back out into the crisp, biting Denver air. The sunlight felt harsh and unforgiving. I walked slowly to my car, gripping the steering wheel, as my mind raced with terrifying questions. Why was my proud, powerful wife being physically assaulted and extorted by a 29-year-old woman? What was in that thick envelope? And much more terrifyingly, what exactly was in that small, dark glass vial? The illusion of my perfect life was dead, and I knew with absolute certainty that the enemy was already sleeping inside my house. I drove back to the estate with a strange calm settling over my mind. For a man who had just witnessed the utter collapse of his family reality, my hands were remarkably steady on the steering wheel. I pulled through the wrought iron gates and parked in the circular driveway. The house looked exactly as it always did, a sprawling architectural masterpiece of stone and glass, surrounded by manicured gardens. It was a monument to the life I had built, a fortress of success and security. But as I walked up the broad stone steps and unlocked the heavy mahogany front door, the silence inside felt different. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a comfortable retirement. It felt like walking into a carefully constructed trap. I paused in the grand foyer, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. I had spent 40 years negotiating with some of the most ruthless executives in the corporate world. I knew how to wear a mask. I knew how to project absolute ease while my mind calculated every possible angle of attack. I hung my coat in the closet and walked toward the soft, warm light spilling from the kitchen. Cynthia was standing by the marble island, the picture of domestic perfection. She wore a soft cashmere sweater, her hair styled, humming a quiet melody as she moved about the kitchen. It was the exact image of the devoted wife that she had maintained for 4 decades. If I had not just watched her hand over a bribe after being struck across the face by our new daughter-in-law, I would have thought she was the most wonderful woman on earth. She was preparing my nightly tea. It was a special blend she had started brewing for me about a year ago. Right around the time I began complaining of sudden unexplained lethargy and a persistent mental fog that made it difficult to focus on complex business documents. I had visited my doctors assuming it was simply the natural decline that comes with turning 70. Cynthia had been so supportive. She researched holistic remedies, reorganized my diet, and insisted on making this tea for me every evening before bed. She told me it was an ancient recipe designed to clear the mind and promote deep, restorative sleep. I had trusted her. I had drank every cup with gratitude. I stepped into the kitchen and offered her a warm, easy smile. I asked her how her charity luncheon went, keeping my voice light and casual. She turned around, returning my smile with an effortless grace that made my stomach turn. She told me the luncheon was a success and that everyone was still raving about how spectacular Derek and Monica looked at the wedding. As she brought the steaming mug of tea over to the breakfast table, where I always sat, I looked closely at her face. Despite the application of her makeup, the harsh kitchen lighting revealed a faint dark shadow along her left cheekbone. It was a concealed bruise exactly where Monica had slapped her. I thanked her for the tea and wrapped my hands around the mug. I looked down at the dark amber liquid, watching the tendrils of steam rise into the air. I took a slow breath and decided it was time to test the waters. I told her that I had been thinking about the reception, and I mentioned that I thought I saw her and Monica having an intense conversation near the back service corridor. I kept my tone mild, framing it as a casual observation from a concerned husband who just wanted to make sure his family was getting along. Cynthia did not flinch. Her hands did not tremble. Her heart rate did not seem to elevate. She sat down in the chair across from me and let out a soft sigh. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She told me that brides are under an immense amount of pressure and that weddings often bring out the worst anxieties in young women. She smiled a practiced motherly smile. She said, "Oh, darling, it was nothing to worry about." Monica had a minor panic attack because the lace hem of her dress tore slightly when she was dancing. She was devastated and inconsolable. I took her aside to the quiet hallway just to calm her down and breathe with her. She was frantic that she flailed her arms and she accidentally hit me in the face. She cried and apologized for an hour. I felt terrible for the poor girl. I wanted to do something to soothe her nerves and welcome her into our family properly. So, the envelope you might have seen me give her was just a private wedding gift. It was the vintage diamond necklace my mother left me. I handed it to her privately because I did not want to make a big spectacle of it in front of the other guests. It was just a moment between a mother and a daughter trying to make everything perfect for her special day. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the smooth, comforting rhythm of her voice. It was a brilliant piece of fiction. It was the logical lie. Any normal husband would have accepted that story without a second thought. It provided a rational explanation for the argument in the hallway. It explained the physical blow to her face as a frantic accident rather than an intentional act of violence. It offered a sentimental reason for the exchange of the thick envelope. She had woven a narrative so tight and believable that it made me doubt my own eyes. But my mind was no longer clouded by the blind trust of a devoted partner. I was looking at her through the cold, objective lens of a man fighting for his survival. She had explained the slap. She had explained the envelope. But she failed to mention the most important detail of that entire silent exchange. She did not say a word about the small dark glass vial she had frantically pressed into Monica's waiting hands. That glaring omission was the fatal hole in her beautiful story. It was the one piece of damning evidence she firmly believed I had not seen. I looked at the woman sitting calmly across from me, the the woman who was watching me with a sickening look of fabricated affection. I pulled my hand away from hers, making absolute sure not to show any rigid movement or display a single ounce of the raw rage burning inside my chest. I offered her my most reassuring smile. I told her that she was a wonderful mother and that Derek was truly lucky to have her looking out for his new bride. I thanked her for the herbal tea, telling her exactly how much I appreciated her taking good care of my health. I picked up the heavy mug by the handle, stood up slowly from the kitchen table, and walked down the shadowed hallway toward the isolation of my private study. The heavy oak door of my study clicked shut behind me, isolating me from the rest of the house. I stood alone in the center of the room, the mug of steaming herbal tea clutched tightly in my hands. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my palms, providing a stark contrast to the icy dread currently spreading through my veins. I walked over to my massive mahogany desk and set the mug down on a leather coaster. For 40 years, I had built my immense fortune by reading between the lines. I had ruthlessly analyzed corporate contracts, spotted hidden liabilities, and anticipated the deceitful maneuvers of my most aggressive competitors. My entire career was built on an unyielding intuition, an internal alarm system that never once failed me. And right now, that intuition was screaming at me with deafening intensity. I sank heavily into my executive chair and stared at the dark amber liquid. The fragrant steam rising from the mug smelled of chamomile lavender and something faintly sweet. It was the exact same scent that had filled this room every single night for the past 12 months. Cynthia called it her special remedy. She claimed she had spent weeks researching holistic medicine to help me overcome the sudden severe mental lethargy that had begun to plague my days. I had believed her completely. I had trusted my wife when she handed me this cup, believing it was an act of profound love and devotion. But as I watched the steam curl into the air, the image of that security footage played on a relentless loop in my mind. I saw the dark, unmarked glass vial passing from my wife's manicured hands into the aggressive grip of my new daughter-in-law. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together. The timing was entirely too perfect. My mysterious cognitive decline, the sudden inability to focus on complex financial documents, the constant fatigue that made me hand over more and more operational control of my company to my son. All of it had started exactly 1 year ago, exactly when Cynthia introduced this nightly herbal ritual into my life. My heart hammered against my ribs, a heavy rhythmic thud that echoed loudly in the quiet space. I looked at the tea, then across the room, at the large flourishing Boston fern standing in the corner. I did not want to believe it. A part of my soul begged me to drink the tea, to go to sleep, to wake up tomorrow, and pretend none of this was happening. But a man does not survive 4 decades in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate by ignoring the facts in front of him. I picked up the mug. My hands were perfectly steady. I walked over to the corner of the room and slowly poured the entire contents of the mug into the soil of the potted fern. The dark liquid seeped into the dirt, vanishing without a trace. I returned to my desk, set the empty mug down, and turned off the reading lamp. I walked upstairs to our master bedroom. Cynthia was already asleep, her breathing soft and even. I slid into bed beside her, keeping my back turned. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I lay there in the absolute darkness, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the woman who might be trying to destroy me, waiting for the dawn to reveal the terrible truth. When the first rays of morning sunlight finally broke through the heavy curtains, I opened my eyes. I lay perfectly still for a moment, mentally bracing myself for the usual heavy, suffocating fog that greeted me every morning. For a year, waking up had felt like wading through thick mud. My thoughts were always disjointed, my body heavy, my reactions agonizingly slow. But this morning was incredibly different. I blinked at the ceiling and my vision was remarkably sharp. I sat up on the edge of the mattress. There was absolutely no dizziness. There was no crushing lethargy pressing down on my shoulders. My mind felt incredibly clear, operating with a rapid, focused precision that I had not experienced in 12 agonizing months. I stood up and walked to the attached bathroom. I looked at my reflection in the large mirror. The man staring back at me did not look like a confused, ailing 70-year-old. He looked like the ruthless corporate titan who had built an empire from the ground up. The sheer contrast between yesterday and today was staggering. It was absolute, undeniable proof. The horrific reality washed over me cold and unforgiving. My wife was poisoning me. The woman I had loved, protected, and provided for over the last 40 years had been systematically feeding me a powerful cognitive suppressant. She had watched me struggle. She had held my hand during doctor's appointments while I expressed my deep fear of developing dementia. She had comforted me with sweet lies, all while carefully measuring out the exact dosage of poison required to slowly erase my mind. The betrayal was so profound, so deeply calculated, that it completely bypassed sorrow and immediately ignited a burning, unquenchable rage. I gripped the edges of the bathroom sink tightly. I was locked in a cage with a dangerous predator. I was living in a beautiful, sprawling estate with a woman who smiled at me over breakfast while actively plotting my mental destruction. If I confronted her right now, she would utterly deny it. She would dispose of the vial instantly. She would use my recent history of confusion to convince everyone, including my son, that I was simply having a paranoid breakdown. I had no hard evidence, only my restored clarity and a security video of a slap in a quiet hallway. To survive this nightmare, I had to play dead. I had to convince my wife and my daughter-in-law that their insidious plan was working flawlessly. They needed to believe that the poison was taking its full effect, that the powerful patriarch of the family was rapidly turning into a helpless, compliant old man. I took a deep breath, deliberately letting my shoulders slump forward. I relaxed my facial muscles, practicing a vacant, unfocused stare in the mirror. I slowed my breathing and altered my posture, transforming myself back into the sluggish, foggy shadow of a man they expected to see. My mind was racing, with terrifying clarity rapidly mapping out a brutal counter-offensive, but my exterior showed nothing but a pathetic decline. I walked out of the bathroom, dragging my feet slightly against the plush carpet. I stumbled downstairs toward the kitchen, ready to greet my attempted murderer with a vacant smile and a deliberate tremor in my hands. The real hunt had officially begun, and I was going to use their own arrogance completely against them right now. I knew that every single step I took from this moment forward had to be executed with flawless, calculating precision. They thought I was entirely broken, but they had merely awakened a sleeping monster. I was fully prepared to destroy everything to survive today completely. I walked into the sunlit kitchen with a slow, deliberate shuffle. My shoulders sagged, and I let my jaw remain slightly slack. Cynthia was standing by the espresso machine, humming a cheerful tune. When she saw me, her face softened into a mask of manufactured sympathy. I rubbed my temples, squeezing my eyes shut, as if fighting off a massive headache. I told her the fog was exceptionally thick this morning, that I could barely remember my dreams. She rushed to my side, placing a cool hand on my forehead. She cooed soft words of reassurance, promising me the new tea needed just a few weeks to build up. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to recoil from her touch. I nodded weakly and told her I needed to go into the office for just a few hours. I assured her I would take it easy, merely signing routine paperwork before coming straight home to rest. She kissed my cheek and watched me walk out the front door, fully believing her sinister plan was working perfectly. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut behind me, the tired, sluggish old man completely vanished. I straightened my spine. My stride became sharp, purposeful, and driven by an absolute rage. I bypassed my driver and took my personal sedan. I deliberately avoided my corporate headquarters. I knew that if Cynthia and Monica were planning a hostile takeover, my internal legal teams might already be compromised. I needed total secrecy. I drove across town, weaving through the busy Denver traffic, until I reached a nondescript brick building in a quiet commercial district. This was the private office of Bradley. He was a fiercely independent attorney, a relentless bulldog in the courtroom. and a man who owed his early career to a favor I had done for him 30 years ago. Bradley was loyal only to me, entirely outside the sphere of my company payroll. I walked into his private suite and closed the soundproof doors. I laid out the exact situation. I told him I suspected a massive attack on my personal assets, orchestrated by my own family. Bradley did not question my sanity. He saw the cold fire in my eyes. I ordered him to execute a covert and exhaustive audit of every single personal account, corporate trust, and holding company associated with my name. He was to look for any unauthorized transfers, modified beneficiaries, or sudden shifts in voting power. While Bradley began tearing through my financial life, I made a second stop. I drove to a private parking garage downtown to meet Victor. Victor was a high-end private investigator, a former intelligence officer who specialized in corporate espionage. I sat in the passenger seat of his tinted vehicle and handed him the flash drive containing the security footage from the restaurant. I instructed Victor to dig into the shadows. I needed a comprehensive background check on Monica, my new daughter-in-law. I wanted to know about every debt, every secret relationship, and every hidden alias she possessed. I also told him to run a parallel investigation on Cynthia, mapping her daily movements, her private phone records, and any associates she met with outside of her usual social circles. Victor pocketed the drive, gave a curt nod, and promised me preliminary results within 24 hours. I spent the rest of the day sitting in a rented hotel room, creating a sterile environment where I could think without the walls listening. The waiting was a unique kind of torture. By late afternoon, my encrypted phone vibrated. It was Bradley. He requested that I return to his office immediately, stating that he had found something massive that required my physical presence. I drove back with a profound sense of dread anchoring my stomach. When I walked into Bradley's office, he was standing by a large conference table covered in freshly printed financial documents. His face was grim, entirely devoid of his usual confident swagger. He pointed to a specific stack of papers in the center of the table. He told me that my suspicions were not only correct, but they were vastly underestimating the scale of the betrayal. Bradley revealed that exactly 1 week before the wedding, a staggering $5 million had been quietly and methodically transferred out of my primary corporate retirement fund. The money did not go to a verifiable investment account. It was wired directly into a newly established, irrevocable blind trust located in an offshore jurisdiction. I stared at the black ink on the white paper, feeling a chilling numbness spread through my chest. $5 million. It was a surgical strike against my foundational wealth. I asked Bradley how such a massive transfer could bypass the strict dual authentication security protocols I had personally established. Bradley silently slid the final authorization page across the table toward me. I looked down at the signature line. The document bore a perfect, flawless digital replication of my own personal signature. It was an encrypted key that I kept highly secured, meaning someone had physically accessed my private terminal while I was incapacitated by the poisoned tea. But that was not the detail that made my breath catch in my throat. Below my forged signature was the required secondary authorization. It was a real physical signature penned in blue ink. It belonged to my son, Derek. I stared at his familiar handwriting. The letters were slightly shaky, but undeniably his. The betrayal crushed the breath from my lungs. My own flesh and blood had signed the document that drained my retirement fund. The very son I had spent my life protecting had actively participated in a massive financial theft against his own father. My mind reeled as I tried to process the sheer magnitude of the conspiracy. Was Derek the true mastermind behind this entire operation? Was he orchestrating my cognitive decline with his new wife to expedite his inheritance? Or was he simply a pawn, an unknowing victim caught in a web of manipulation spun by Cynthia and Monica? The shaky nature of his signature hinted at fear, a deep, pervasive anxiety that I had noticed during the wedding. I remembered the nervous energy, the way he constantly deferred to Monica, the way he seemed to shrink whenever she entered a room. If Derek was a victim, he was a victim who held the key to dismantling this entire criminal enterprise. But if he was a willing participant, he was a traitor who needed to be crushed alongside the rest of them. I looked up at Bradley. I told him to trace the blind trust, to find the exact destination of those funds, no matter how deep he had to dig. I left the office with a terrifying mission. I needed to isolate my son. I needed to rip him away from the venomous influence of his mother and his wife, lock him in a room, and break him down until the absolute truth spilled out. The trap was closing rapidly around my neck. The only way to survive was to force my son to choose a side before the final blow was struck. I called Derek the following morning, keeping my voice intentionally weak and slightly raspy over the phone. I told him I was feeling incredibly nostalgic and wanted to spend the weekend at our remote hunting cabin up by Grand Lake. I framed it as a quiet father and son bonding trip, just like we used to take before he joined the corporate world. To my absolute surprise, Derek agreed immediately, without asking for Monica to tag along. We drove up on Friday afternoon. The journey took nearly 3 hours through winding mountain roads lined with dense pine trees. The further we got from the Denver city limits, the more the suffocating grip of my wife and daughter-in-law seemed to loosen from my neck. But the man sitting in the passenger seat next to me was not the sharp, confident young executive who had just gotten married a few days ago. He was a ghost. I kept my eyes on the road, but my peripheral vision cataloged every single terrifying detail of my son. He looked utterly exhausted. His cheekbones protruded sharply from a face that had lost significant weight in a remarkably short amount of time. He was sweating despite the cool air conditioning blowing through the cabin of the car. His hands rested on his lap, but his fingers were trembling with a constant, uncontrollable micro-tremor. When we finally arrived at the cabin, I asked him to help me carry the groceries inside. Derek stumbled on the wooden porch stairs, nearly dropping a simple canvas bag. He apologized profusely, his eyes darting around the quiet forest, as if he expected someone to jump out from behind the trees. His sentences were fragmented, his speech slightly slurred. He rubbed his temples constantly, complaining about a thick, unyielding pressure behind his eyes. It was the exact same crushing mental fog that had plagued me for an entire year. The realization sent a fresh wave of sheer horror crashing through my veins. Cynthia and Monica were not just poisoning me to push me out of the picture. They were chemically subjugating my son. They were breaking down his cognitive defenses to turn him into an obedient, malleable puppet. I watched him sink heavily into the worn leather sofa by the stone fireplace. He looked incredibly fragile, stripped of all his independence. I walked over to the kitchen counter and poured 2 glasses of sparkling water. I did not make tea. I did not offer him any food that I had not personally prepared from sealed packages. I carried the glasses over to the living room and sat down in the heavy oak armchair directly across from him. I needed him to focus. I needed him to hear exactly what I was about to say without any of the manipulative noise of his home life echoing in his ears. I looked at my son for a long silent moment. The facade of the frail, declining old man completely vanished from my posture. I straightened my spine. My gaze sharpened into the cold, ruthless stare of a corporate chairman sitting across a negotiation table. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that commanded absolute attention. I asked him directly why his signature was on the transfer order that drained $5 million from my private retirement fund. Derek froze. The glass of water in his hand slipped, spilling cold liquid across his jeans and the woven rug. He did not try to clean it up. His chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths. Panic flooded his sunken eyes. He stammered, shaking his head frantically, trying to string together a coherent sentence. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, refusing to let him look away from me. I demanded the truth. I told him I had the digital tracking records from Bradley, and I knew exactly what happened last week. The remaining walls of his psychological defense collapsed entirely. Derek buried his face in his trembling hands and began to weep. It was not the quiet crying of a guilty man. It was the desperate, broken sobbing of a trapped animal. Between gasping breaths, the horrifying truth finally began to spill out into the quiet cabin. He confessed that Monica had forced him to authorize the wire transfer. She had sat him down in their pristine kitchen, screaming that my mental state was deteriorating at a terrifying speed. She convinced him that I was making erratic, destructive financial choices that were going to bankrupt the entire family within months. She told Derek that her own elite financial advisors needed to secure the $5 million in an irrevocable trust to protect their marital assets before I lost everything. I felt my jaw tighten with fury, but I let him continue. Derek looked up at me with tear-filled eyes, begging for my forgiveness. He admitted the most twisted, sickening part of the entire conspiracy. He told me he initially refused to sign the documents, knowing it felt wrong to move my money behind my back. But then his own mother intervened. Cynthia had cornered him in the hallway of my own home. She held his face in her hands and wept, telling him that my dementia was advancing far faster than any of the doctors had predicted. She pressured him, leveraging 40 years of maternal trust. She promised him that securing the funds in Monica's offshore trust was the only way to save the family legacy from my supposed madness. My own wife had weaponized a false medical diagnosis to manipulate our son into stealing my life savings. The profound cruelty of their coordination was staggering. They had isolated him, fed him a steady diet of lies, and drugged him into a state of severe mental compliance. But Derek was not completely finished speaking yet. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He revealed that the $5 million was only the beginning of their plan. He told me Monica was relentless, watching his every move, controlling his schedule, and isolating him from his friends. She had drafted a new set of binding legal documents. By next Monday morning, she was forcing him to permanently sign over 40% of his voting shares in my commercial real estate firm directly into her name. She claimed it was a necessary step for their future estate planning. If he gave her those shares, she would possess enough corporate leverage to completely outvote me on the executive board. Derek was absolutely terrified of the woman he had just married. As I sat in the silent cabin watching my son shake with genuine fear, a terrifying realization crystallized in my mind. Monica was not just a greedy bride looking for a quick payout. She was executing a highly sophisticated, hostile takeover of my entire multi-million-dollar empire, and my wife was eagerly handing her the keys to the kingdom. But why would Cynthia, a woman who prized our legacy and her social standing above all else, willingly destroy her own family for a manipulative, dangerous grifter? I needed to find the answer to that agonizing question. I needed to understand the true depth of this betrayal, and I knew my terrified son was in no condition to provide it. Derek was a broken pawn, shivering in the quiet cabin, completely paralyzed by the fear of the two women who held his strings. I promised my son that I would handle the situation, instructing him to remain at the cabin for a few more days under the guise of an extended fishing trip. I assured him that he was safe as long as he stayed completely out of sight. I drove back down the mountain toward Denver, the cold mountain air doing nothing to chill the inferno of calculated rage burning inside my chest. I had the financial evidence from Bradley, and I had the confession from my son. But to dismantle a conspiracy of this magnitude, I needed raw, unfiltered proof of their ultimate endgame. I needed to hear them plotting in their own words. I returned to my sprawling estate on Sunday evening. As I walked through the heavy mahogany front door, I instantly dropped my shoulders, allowing the calculated posture of a weary, failing old man to overtake my frame. I rubbed my temples, shuffling across the hardwood floors, exhaling a long sigh. Cynthia emerged from the formal dining room, her face instantly melting into that sickening mask of absolute manufactured concern. She rushed to my side, placing her hand gently on my arm, asking if the mountain air had helped clear my terrible brain fog. I forced a weak, unconvincing smile. I told her the trip was exhausting, that my mind was slipping more than I wanted to admit, and that Derek had decided to stay behind to enjoy some peace and quiet. She guided me toward the living room sofa, pouring me a glass of iced water and cooing soft, poisonous words of comfort. I played the role flawlessly. I was the declining patriarch, a man slowly losing his grip on his own reality, completely dependent on the mercy of his loving wife. The next morning, I initiated the next phase of my counteroffensive. I sat at the breakfast table, moving my spoon sluggishly through a bowl of oatmeal. I looked up at Cynthia with a look of manufactured anxiety. I announced that I had completely forgotten about a mandatory real estate conference in Seattle. I told her the firm needed me there for 3 days to secure a massive commercial zoning permit, and that my absence would raise unnecessary questions among the executive board. I played up my confusion, acting as though this sudden realization was deeply distressing. Cynthia, always the supportive partner, immediately sprang into action. She packed my overnight bags with practiced efficiency, soothing my fabricated anxieties with promises that a few days of normal business would be good for my routine. She even insisted on driving me to the airport herself, claiming she did not want me navigating the chaotic terminals alone in my current condition. I sat in the passenger seat of her luxury vehicle, staring out the window as we drove toward the airport. She chattered happily about her upcoming week, mentioning a spa day and a few charity board meetings. I merely nodded, offering vague, agreeable responses. When she dropped me off at the departure curb, she leaned over and kissed my cheek. She told me to call her the moment I landed in Seattle, and she promised to have a fresh batch of my special herbal tea waiting for me when I returned on Thursday. I smiled, a tight, cold expression that she mistook for gratitude, and walked through the sliding glass doors into the bustling terminal. I did not check any luggage. I did not approach the security checkpoints. I walked straight through the main concourse, bypassed the ticketing counters entirely, and exited through the ground transportation doors on the opposite side of the airport. I hailed a waiting cab and gave the driver the address of a discreet, unremarkable hotel located in the industrial district on the edge of the city. It was a place where nobody from my corporate circle or my social class would ever wander. I checked into my room under a false name, paying in cash. I locked the deadbolt, pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut, and set my overnight bag on the small desk. I unzipped the leather duffel and pulled out a heavy, matte black carrying case. It contained the highly specialized surveillance equipment that Victor, my private investigator, had provided me. Before leaving my estate that morning while Cynthia was upstairs packing my bags, I had moved through my own home like a ghost. I had spent years analyzing structural blueprints, and I knew exactly how sound traveled through those massive rooms. I had planted military-grade microphones in 3 strategic locations. I secured one beneath the heavy oak table in the formal dining room. I hid another deep inside the leather upholstery of the passenger seat in Cynthia's car. The third device was placed behind a decorative bronze wall sconce in the main living room, overlooking the custom wet bar. The microphones were completely undetectable, designed to pick up whispers from across a crowded room and transmit the encrypted audio feed directly to the secure receiver in my possession. I sat down in the uncomfortable hotel chair, the room illuminated only by the faint, pulsing blue light of the receiver unit on the desk. I placed the noise-canceling headphones over my ears and adjusted the volume dial. The waiting was an agonizing test of endurance. I sat in the darkness, staring at the blank wall, listening to the hollow static of an empty house. Hours crawled by in agonizingly slow increments. I heard the distant muffled sound of the housekeeper vacuuming the upstairs hallway. I heard the faint chime of the grandfather clock in the foyer, striking noon, then 1, then 2. I was a man hunting in the shadows of his own life, waiting for the predators to step out into the light. My back ached, my eyes burned, but I did not remove the headphones for a single second. I knew that their arrogance would eventually betray them. I knew they would not wait long to celebrate my supposed absence. Finally, just as the sun began to set outside my hotel window, the audio feed crackled to life with a sharp, distinct sound. It was the heavy thud of the front door opening and closing. The sudden noise sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. I leaned closer to the receiver, pressing the headphones tightly against my ears. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels against the marble floor of the foyer. A woman was walking into the house. A second set of footsteps followed immediately behind her. The sound moved smoothly from the entryway directly into the main living room, passing right into the primary acoustic range of the hidden microphone. A voice broke the silence. It was Cynthia. Monica immediately responded with a laugh. The two women were alone, pouring my expensive scotch. I sat in the dim light of the rented hotel room, the noise-canceling headphones pressed tightly against my ears. The clear audio feed from my own living room painted a vivid picture of the betrayal unfolding miles away. I heard the sharp, unmistakable clink of two heavy crystal tumblers coming together in a celebratory toast. Cynthia and Monica were laughing. It was a dark, venomous sound that echoed with the absolute arrogance of two predators who believed they had successfully consumed their prey. I could hear the rich liquid of my scotch pouring generously into their glasses. They were speaking in hushed, excited tones, congratulating each other on how easily I had been dispatched to Seattle. Cynthia chuckled, her voice dripping with condescension, as she mocked my supposed mental decline, boasting about how simple it had been to pack my bags and shuffle me out the door. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the edge of the desk. I was listening to the architects of my destruction bask in their victory. But before I could decipher the specific details of their ongoing conversation, a sharp, rhythmic knock at my hotel room door shattered the quiet tension. I carefully pulled the headphones down around my neck, instantly muting the live audio feed. I stood up, crossed the short distance to the door, and peered through the small glass peephole. Victor was standing in the dimly lit hallway. He wore a dark tailored overcoat and held two thick manila folders under his left arm. I unfastened the deadbolt and pulled the door open, motioning for the private investigator to step inside quickly. Victor did not offer a polite greeting. His face was a rigid mask of professional gravity. He stepped into the room, scanning the drawn curtains and the glowing blue surveillance receiver on the desk with a glance. He walked directly toward the small sitting area and dropped the two massive dossiers onto the glass coffee table. The thud of the paper hitting the glass sounded like a judge bringing down a final gavel. I locked the door behind him and walked over to the table, feeling the suffocating weight of anticipation pressing heavily against my chest. Victor unbuttoned his overcoat and took a breath. He looked me squarely in the eyes and stated that the preliminary background checks were completely finished. He warned me that what he had uncovered during his excavation was going to disturb me. I told him I had already survived watching my wife and new daughter-in-law poison my mind and drain my retirement accounts. I instructed him to dispense with the pleasantries and deliver the raw, unfiltered truth. Victor nodded, his expression devoid of emotion. He reached out and placed his hand flat against the first thick manila folder. He told me that this particular file contained the entire history of Monica, the elegant, flawless bride my son had just married. Victor opened the heavy cover of the dossier, revealing dozens of printed financial records, grainy surveillance photographs, and deeply redacted police reports. He began to dismantle the beautiful, elaborate fiction that Monica had so flawlessly presented to our family. He explained that her old money pedigree, the wealthy East Coast upbringing, the prestigious boarding schools, and the tragic loss of her aristocratic parents were nothing but an entirely fabricated illusion. Monica was a phantom. She was a highly skilled professional grifter who had spent the last decade operating under at least 6 different legal aliases across 4 different states. Victor pointed to a series of fraudulent birth certificates and forged university diplomas. He detailed how she systematically targeted wealthy families, embedding herself into their lives before executing devastating financial extractions. But Victor cautioned that her current operation against my family was not a routine grift. This specific infiltration was driven by an urgency. He pulled a highlighted financial ledger from the back of the folder and slid it across the glass table. Victor revealed that Monica was drowning under a mountain of debt. She currently owed over $3 million to a highly organized, violent, illegal gambling syndicate operating out of the criminal underbelly of Las Vegas. The brutal enforcers of this syndicate had given her a non-negotiable deadline to clear her massive ledger. That terrifying deadline perfectly explained the speed of her actions. It explained why she had forced my son to blindly authorize the immediate transfer of $5 million into an offshore trust just days before the wedding. It explained why she was aggressively orchestrating a hostile takeover of my commercial real estate empire by demanding Derek sign over 40% of his voting shares by next Monday morning. She was completely desperate, fighting for her actual life, and she was using my hard-earned family fortune to pay off her lethal debts. I stared at the staggering criminal documentation spread out across the table, processing the terrifying reality of the woman sleeping under my roof. But a massive, glaring contradiction suddenly burned through the center of this horrifying revelation. I looked up at Victor, my mind racing, to connect the fractured pieces. I told him that none of this explained Cynthia's active participation. My wife was a notorious, uncompromising socialite. She was a woman who was absolutely obsessed with pedigree, pristine reputations, and flawless public standing. She scrutinized every single person who entered our social circle with ruthless, unforgiving prejudice. There was absolutely no logical reason why a woman like Cynthia would ever allow a common, desperate street grifter to marry her only son. There was no reason why my proud wife would willingly administer a cognitive poison to me or actively help a criminal drain $5 million from our own family accounts. It made zero sense for Cynthia to hand the keys of our empire over to a dangerous fraud. Victor simply nodded his eyes, reflecting a grim, chilling understanding. He told me that he had asked himself the exact same question during his investigation. He reached back onto the table and picked up the second thick folder. Victor solemnly handed the second dossier to me, stating that the answer to my question was buried inside. I slowly opened the heavy cover and stared at a series of high-resolution surveillance photographs. They showed Cynthia sitting in various dimly lit hotel lobbies and secluded restaurants, intensely negotiating with several unfamiliar, highly suspicious men. Victor pointed at the faces of these strangers, identifying them as a notorious group of international crypto fraudsters who specialized in complex, unregulated scams. The final piece of the devastating puzzle violently snapped into place. Victor looked at me with deep gravity and revealed the ultimate crushing truth. Cynthia had not been protecting our family legacy at all. Over the past 5 agonizing years, my wife had secretly embezzled and completely lost over $8 million of my personal wealth in a series of illegal, catastrophic offshore Ponzi schemes. She was utterly bankrupt behind the scenes, drowning in her own secret, catastrophic financial ruins. She desperately needed Monica's ruthless, rapid corporate takeover to permanently bury the massive, glaring holes in her own devastating financial ledgers before I ever discovered the truth. I sat frozen in the dimly lit hotel room, the cold plastic of the noise-canceling headphones pressing tightly against my ears. The live audio feed from my own living room hissed faintly before stabilizing into absolute horrifying clarity. The sharp clink of heavy crystal tumblers touching in a celebratory toast echoed through the digital transmission. I could clearly hear the rich amber liquid of my aged scotch splashing over the ice. Cynthia and Monica were laughing. It was not the polite, measured laughter they displayed at family dinners. It was a dark, guttural, triumphant sound that made my blood run cold. They were entirely alone in the estate, completely confident that their fabricated reality was holding strong. They believed I was trapped in a hotel room in Seattle, a confused, declining old man entirely out of their way. I gripped the edge of the desk, closing my eyes and focusing every ounce of my attention on the voices transmitted through the receiver. Monica was the first to speak at length. Her voice was dripping with a sickly, arrogant confidence that entirely replaced the sweet, demure persona she had worn for the past 12 months. She took a slow sip of the scotch and let out a satisfied sigh. She began to recount with chilling amusement the precise moment she had locked her claws into my family. Monica casually reminded Cynthia of the charity gala in Aspen exactly 1 year ago. That was the night Monica, leveraging her grifter skills, had secretly bypassed the security on Cynthia's laptop. She laughed as she described the paralyzing panic on my wife's face when she confronted her the following morning with the undeniable evidence of the $8 million offshore Ponzi scheme disaster. Monica gloated about how easily she had weaponized that catastrophic secret. She had laid out a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum. Cynthia had to meticulously push Derek into a rapid romance orchestrated by Monica, or Monica would release the ledgers to me, to the corporate board, and to the federal authorities. I listened as the flawless bride ruthlessly detailed her extortion. She mocked my son, calling Derek a pathetic pawn who was desperate for his mother's approval. Monica then shifted the topic to the immediate financial victory. She openly celebrated the $5 million wire transfer that had occurred just days before the wedding. She called it a mandatory down payment for her continued silence. She bragged about how easy it was to terrify Derek into signing the secondary authorization, knowing the illegal gambling syndicate in Las Vegas was breathing down her neck for their $3 million. She needed that massive influx of untraceable cash to appease the violent enforcers who held her life in their hands. I expected Cynthia to sound remorseful. I expected to hear the trembling voice of a desperate mother forced to sacrifice her son to save her own skin. But the voice that responded over the audio feed was completely devoid of sorrow. Cynthia let out a short, dismissive laugh that shattered any lingering illusion I had about the woman I had married 40 years ago. Her tone was terrifyingly cold, calculating, and entirely pragmatic. She was not a victim in this scenario. She was an active, enthusiastic co-conspirator. Cynthia assured Monica that the entire operation was moving forward with flawless precision. My wife calmly stated that my mind was practically gone destroyed by the daily application of the toxic drops she had been slipping into my herbal tea. She boasted about how easily she had convinced me that my cognitive decline was simply a natural symptom of old age. She detailed the final phase of their master plan, with the clinical detachment of a corporate raider dismantling a rival company. Cynthia confirmed that the timeline was perfectly set for Monday morning. Once Monica successfully terrified Derek into signing over his 40% of the corporate voting shares, the trap would snap permanently shut. Cynthia laid out the sequence of events. With Monica holding Derek's proxy and Cynthia utilizing her marital leverage, they would convene an emergency meeting of the executive board. They would present my engineered mental confusion as undeniable proof of severe rapid onset dementia. They planned to declare me legally incompetent, forcefully stripping me of all operational control over the commercial real estate empire I had spent my entire adult life building. Once they seized the chairman's seat, they would aggressively liquidate the most lucrative commercial assets in the company portfolio. Cynthia calmly explained that they would use the newly liquidated corporate funds to quietly pay off the remaining balance of Monica's lethal syndicate debts. In exchange for handing over the keys to the kingdom, Cynthia would funnel the rest of the capital into her own private accounts, entirely erasing the $8 million deficit she had created, permanently hiding her financial crimes before I or the authorities could ever notice. I sat in the darkness, the sheer magnitude of their malice washing over me in suffocating waves. My wife of 4 decades was casually plotting my institutionalization while sipping my scotch. She was willing to destroy our son's future, dismantle my legacy, and hand our wealth over to a dangerous criminal, all to preserve her pristine social reputation. My hands shook, not from the phantom brain fog, but from a rage so profound it threatened to crack my ribs. I had heard enough. I had the entire conspiracy outlined in their own words. I was ready to rip the headphones off Call Bradley and Victor and initiate the absolute destruction of their lives. But as I reached for the headset, the audio feed dropped an even darker, more terrifying secret into the quiet hotel room. The conversation in the living room had paused. I heard the clink of the liquor bottle against the crystal glasses as Cynthia poured them another round. When my wife spoke again, her voice had dropped to a low conspiratorial whisper that forced me to press the headphones bruisingly hard against my ears. Cynthia quietly said the board might still present a complication. She worried my loyal executives might demand an independent medical evaluation before voting to remove me. If an outside neurologist examined me and discovered chemical traces of the cognitive suppressant, the hostile takeover would instantly collapse into a federal criminal investigation. Monica did not sound worried at all. I heard the sharp click of her designer lighter followed by the slow exhale of cigarette smoke. Monica told my wife they had already planned for that exact contingency. She stated the $5 million wire transfer had also purchased a highly specialized, untraceable compound from a private contact in the underworld. She told Cynthia that if the board resisted on Monday, or if I showed signs of regaining mental clarity, they would not wait for an evaluation. They would simply transition to the final permanent dosage. I stopped breathing as Monica calmly explained that the new compound would induce a massive fatal cardiac arrest within minutes, mimicking a natural heart attack perfectly. They were not just planning to steal my company and lock me in an institution. They had already purchased the weapon to murder me. I sat completely frozen in the dimly lit hotel room, the horrifying reality of my impending murder echoing endlessly in my ringing ears. The profound silence that followed Monica's dark revelation was incredibly thick, pressing heavily against my chest until I felt entirely suffocated. I had meticulously prepared my mind for absolute financial ruin. I had rigorously braced my spirit for a bitter divorce and a vicious corporate battle. But hearing the woman I had slept next to for 40 years casually discuss my lethal cardiac arrest was a devastating physical blow that instantly shattered the very foundation of my entire existence. I closed my eyes and focused exclusively on drawing a single steady breath. The digital receiver pulsed with a faint blue light, casting long, menacing shadows across the blank hotel walls. I desperately waited for Cynthia to object, to show a single shred of humanity or hesitation at the horrific prospect of violently assassinating her husband. Instead, the live audio feed picked up the distinct sound of ice clinking sharply against crystal. My wife simply took another slow, satisfied sip of my expensive scotch. She murmured her dark approval, stating that a sudden heart attack would perfectly prevent any messy autopsies or lingering questions from the corporate board. It was a flawless exit strategy. Then the conversation shifted, plunging into a depth of depravity that completely eclipsed my own murder. Monica let out a frustrated, dramatic sigh that hissed through the microphone. She complained that Derek was rapidly becoming a serious liability to their entire operation. Her voice grew tight with genuine irritation as she paced aggressively across the hardwood floors of my formal living room. She told Cynthia that the psychological isolation tactics at the remote mountain cabin were beginning to wear off. Derek was growing increasingly suspicious by the hour. He was asking entirely too many questions about the massive $5 million wire transfer, and he was absolutely terrified of the impending executive board meeting. Monica stated that my son had spent the entire morning weeping uncontrollably, desperately, threatening to call his corporate lawyers to legally reverse the proxy authorization. He was resisting the hostile takeover with everything he had left. He was desperately trying to hold on to his inherent loyalty to me, fighting blindly against the mountain of toxic lies they had forcefully fed him over the past week. Monica's frustration continued to escalate through the static of the audio feed. She aggressively warned my wife that if Derek suffered a complete psychological breakdown before Monday morning, their entire meticulously crafted operation would disintegrate into nothing. She fiercely reminded Cynthia of the violent illegal gambling syndicate waiting for their $3 million in Las Vegas. Monica absolutely needed my son to walk into that corporate boardroom and confidently surrender his 40% voting share without a single moment of hesitation. She needed him to smile and hand over the keys to the empire, but his mounting anxiety was making him dangerously erratic and totally unpredictable. I leaned closer to the receiver, my hands gripping the edge of the wooden desk so hard my knuckles throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. I waited in the silence of the hotel room to hear exactly how a mother would respond to the devastating news that her only child was suffering a severe psychological breakdown. I fully expected Cynthia to suggest a gentle approach, to offer maternal reassurance, or perhaps craft a new fabricated story to calm his fragile, breaking nerves. Instead, my wife's voice cut through the audio feed with the cold, mechanical precision of a slaughterhouse butcher. Cynthia did not offer a single word of comfort. She offered a chemical solution. She told Monica to simply up his dosage. The brutal words hung in the air, dripping with an absolute chilling malice that completely defied human comprehension. Cynthia ruthlessly instructed her new daughter-in-law to use the dark glass vial she had handed over in the secluded restaurant hallway during the wedding reception. My wife's voice remained perfectly steady, utterly devoid of any maternal affection or basic empathy. She ordered Monica to put 4 drops into Derek's morning coffee instead of the usual 2. Cynthia calmly clinically explained that the elevated dosage was highly effective at breaking down neurological resistance. She said it keeps Harrison docile, and it will keep Derek perfectly compliant until the ink is completely dry on Monday morning. She spoke of her own son as if he were nothing more than a stubborn piece of farm machinery that required aggressive chemical maintenance to function properly. The physical blow of that horrific truth hit me like a runaway freight train. It was a violent, catastrophic impact that knocked the remaining breath from my lungs. The hotel room began to spin wildly. I tore the noise-canceling headphones away from my ears, letting them fall onto the wooden desk with a heavy clatter. I stared blankly at the wall, my mind desperately trying to reject the monstrous reality I had just witnessed. Cynthia was not just poisoning her husband to steal a corporate empire. She was actively instructing a professional grifter to chemically lobotomize her own flesh and blood. She was willing to completely destroy her son's mind, forcefully subjugating his free will with a dangerous, untraceable cognitive suppressant just to cover up her massive financial crimes and offshore losses. She was actively sacrificing the boy we had raised, the child she had carried, using him as a disposable human shield to permanently protect her fraudulent ledgers. The sheer magnitude of her depravity was far beyond human comprehension. It defied every law of nature and every basic instinct of a mother. In that solitary, suffocating hotel room, a profound and irreversible transformation occurred within my very soul. The mourning period ended instantly. Every single ounce of sorrow, every lingering shred of marital affection, and every warm memory of our shared life simply evaporated into the cold, stale air. The loving, devoted husband, who had spent 40 years building a safe, impenetrable fortress for his family, died in that chair. The compassionate, forgiving father, who had eagerly stepped back to let his only son take the corporate reins, completely ceased to exist. When I finally looked up from the dark wooden desk, my eyes were ice cold. The man who remained was a ruthless, unyielding corporate predator who had systematically crushed thousands of enemies in the boardroom without a second thought. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile phone. My hands were no longer shaking in the slightest. My mind was completely clear, operating with a dark, lethal focus that I had not felt in decades. I dialed Bradley's direct, highly secure line. He answered on the very first ring, his voice remarkably tense and highly expectant. I did not offer any polite greetings. I did not explain the horrifying audio feed, the systemic financial betrayals, or the impending murder plot. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying, absolute authority that brokered no debate whatsoever. I told him to prepare the poison pill. I told him we were going to war. It was Friday morning. Exactly 48 hours remained before the Monday executive board meeting, the moment my wife and daughter-in-law planned to execute their hostile takeover and finalize my murder. I left my hotel room with a singular lethal focus. The first step of my counter-offensive required physical evidence. I could not walk into a boardroom armed solely with audio recordings. I needed scientific proof of the poison pulsing through our veins. I called Derek on his private line, ensuring my voice sounded weak and confused. I told my son our corporate life insurance policy required a routine health checkup for all executive board members before the fiscal quarter ended. I insisted we complete this administrative task together right now. Derek, chemically subdued and desperate for any anchor of normalcy, agreed without protest. He promised to meet me at the address I provided, assuring me Monica was out at a bridal salon and would not notice his absence. I did not direct my son to our usual network of corporate physicians. I knew Cynthia had likely compromised anyone within our standard medical sphere. Instead, I drove to a private medical clinic located on the quiet outskirts of the city. The facility was operated by a brilliant diagnostician whose private practice I had quietly funded decades ago. His absolute loyalty was purchased with a massive unrecorded loan when he faced bankruptcy. I waited in the underground parking garage until Derek arrived. My son stepped out of his vehicle looking like a walking corpse. His skin was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled violently. He jumped at the slightest sound, terrified Monica might suddenly appear. I placed a steadying hand on his back and guided him through the rear entrance. The doctor was waiting in a soundproof examination room. I dropped the sluggish facade the moment the heavy door sealed shut. I looked directly into the doctor's eyes and gave him a chilling directive. I ordered an immediate exhaustive toxicology screening for both myself and my son. We sat in the sterile room while staff drew our blood. Derek watched the vials fill with a vacant expression, too exhausted to question my sudden shift in demeanor. For 3 hours, we waited in absolute silence. Finally, the doctor returned. His face was ashen, stripped of his usual calm. He set 2 manila folders down on the stainless steel table and opened them. The reality of my wife's absolute depravity was laid out in stark, undeniable text. The laboratory reports confirmed my worst nightmares. Both of our bloodstreams contained dangerously high, highly toxic concentrations of an illegal synthetic neurodepressant. The doctor explained this specific chemical compound was extremely rare, exclusively manufactured in black market laboratories. It was meticulously designed to mimic the exact symptoms of severe cognitive decline, inducing extreme lethargy, intense paranoia, and profound mental confusion. If left untreated, the accumulation of this toxin would eventually lead to total psychological collapse. I picked up the medical documents. My hands did not shake. I finally held the undeniable physical proof of my wife's lethal conspiracy. She had been slowly killing me, and she had been chemically lobotomizing her own flesh and blood to secure a fortune. With the medical evidence locked inside my briefcase, I left Derek at a private safe house I had rented that morning. I instructed him to stay completely off the grid, turn off his cellular device, and wait for my return. I immediately drove to Bradley's remote legal office. My bulldog attorney was waiting, his desk covered in the financial tracking documents he compiled overnight. I tossed the damning toxicology reports onto his desk. Bradley read through the medical files, his jaw clenching with cold, professional fury. I told him we needed an impenetrable shield, a legal maneuver that would absolutely shatter their hostile takeover before they even realized the trap was sprung. Bradley smiled a sharp, predatory grin. He pulled an old, heavy binder from the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. It was the original corporate charter for my commercial real estate empire, drafted exactly 30 years ago. Bradley explained that Cynthia, despite her meticulous manipulation and exhaustive surveillance of my portfolio, had made a fatal miscalculation. She believed she knew every inch of my corporate structure, but she never bothered to read the ancient foundational documents hidden deep within the company archives. Unbeknownst to my wife and her grifter daughter-in-law, the original charter contained a dormant, highly aggressive poison pill. It was a clause legally designated as the founder's absolute veto. This powerful provision stated that if the original founder ever suspected severe financial fraud, internal embezzlement, or hostile coercion, possessed the unilateral authority to instantly nullify any executive share transfer. Furthermore, invoking this veto would immediately trigger a comprehensive freeze on all corporate assets, bank accounts, and liquid holdings. It was a fail-safe mechanism designed to protect the empire from a hostile coup, requiring only my signature and a certified declaration of suspected fraud to activate. Bradley rapidly drafted the legal counteroffensive. We prepared the documents to trigger the veto, silently timing it perfectly to detonate the moment Monica attempted to ratify the stolen shares on Monday morning. I returned to the secure safe house as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The interior was dark, illuminated only by a table lamp. Derek was sitting on the sofa, his head buried in his hands, trembling with withdrawal symptoms as the cognitive suppressant began to leave his system. I walked over and dropped the stack of documents onto the coffee table. I laid out the brutal reality. I showed my son the confirmed toxicology reports, proving his own mother was systematically poisoning him. I showed him the extensive background checks Victor had compiled detailing Monica's vast criminal history, her multiple aliases, and her massive lethal debts to the violent Las Vegas gambling syndicate. I watched as the final fragments of my son's broken reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. Derek stared at the undeniable proof, his chest heaving with violent, gasping sobs. He broke down weeping, completely devastated by the magnitude of the betrayal. He realized the two women he loved most viewed him as a disposable tool, a pathetic pawn to be chemically destroyed and discarded the moment he served his financial purpose. He wept for the mother who sold his future. He wept for the wife who orchestrated his demise. I stood over him in the quiet shadows of the safe house, letting the bitter sting of the truth wash over his broken spirit. I let him cry for exactly 1 minute. Then I reached out and slapped my hand down hard onto his trembling shoulder. The impact forced him to look up, his tear-filled eyes meeting my cold, unyielding stare. The time for mourning our family was officially over. I tightened my grip on his shoulder, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that commanded absolute obedience. I told him to cry later. I told him that right now we smile, we nod, and we let them walk right into the slaughterhouse. I left the secure safe house early Sunday morning, leaving Derek under my strict instructions to prepare his shattered mind for the performance of his life. I spent the day arranging my return logistics, ensuring every detail of my fake trip to Seattle appeared legitimate. I generated completely false hotel receipts and meticulously rumpled the suits in my travel bag. When the sun began to sink below the skyline, I called a car service to drop me off at my estate. I walked through the heavy front doors just as the tall grandfather clock struck 6. The moment my hand touched the polished brass knob, I let my spine curve forward. I allowed my shoulders to slump, my steps to shorten into a dragging shuffle, and my eyes to lose their sharp focus. I transformed myself back into the exhausted, declining old man my wife so desperately needed me to be. Cynthia heard the front door close and hurried out of the kitchen. She wore a pristine floral dress and an expression of manufactured relief. She rushed toward me, taking my heavy overnight bag and wrapping her arms around my neck. She cooed softly, telling me how much she had worried about me navigating the busy Seattle streets alone. I forced a very hollow, weary smile. I leaned heavily against her shoulder, telling her the real estate conference was a complete blur and that my brain felt stuffed with dense cotton. I thanked her for her unending patience, praising her for being the only anchor holding my fragile mind together. Cynthia smiled warmly, her eyes completely void of genuine affection. She guided me toward the plush sofa in the living room, fluffing a pillow behind my back and telling me to rest while she prepared my special herbal tea. I sat on the sofa closing my eyes, but my senses were heightened to a razor-sharp edge. I had anticipated this exact routine. Tucked discreetly inside my suit jacket pocket was a thick, highly absorbent microfiber towel lined with a waterproof backing. I had spent hours practicing the sleight of hand required to execute this maneuver flawlessly. A few minutes later, Cynthia returned to the living room carrying a silver tray. A delicate porcelain mug rested in the center, steaming with the scent of chamomile and mint. She set the tray down and handed me the mug. I looked up at her, maintaining my confused facade. I watched her manicured hands carefully arrange the napkin. I knew with absolute scientific certainty that the dark liquid inside the cup contained 4 lethal drops of an untraceable neurodepressant. Cynthia sat beside me on the sofa, gently patting my knee. She instructed me to drink it while it was hot, promising that it would soothe my frayed nerves and help me sleep through the night. I lifted the mug to my lips with trembling hands. As I tilted the porcelain rim upward, I feigned a sudden, harsh coughing fit. I turned my head sharply away from her, bringing my free hand and the concealed sponge towel up to my mouth to muffle the sound. In one fluid, practiced motion, I tilted the mug slightly forward, allowing a significant portion of the poisoned tea to spill directly into the absorbent material hidden in my palm. I lowered the mug, wiping my chin with a standard linen napkin, and smiled weakly at my wife. I thanked her, complimenting the soothing taste of the tea, and slowly repeated the process twice more over the next 10 minutes. By the time I set the empty mug back onto the silver tray, Cynthia was beaming with quiet satisfaction. She believed she had just administered the final crippling dose of my cognitive destruction. At 7 o'clock, the heavy front door opened again, signaling the arrival of our Sunday dinner guests. Monica walked into the foyer, holding a bottle of expensive wine, radiating an aura of absolute arrogant confidence. Derek trailed a few steps behind her, and the sight of my son nearly broke my calculated composure. He looked completely hollowed out, a fragile shell of the vibrant young executive he used to be. But Derek remembered his instructions. He remembered the undeniable proof of their lethal conspiracy, and he played his role with a desperate, convincing brilliance. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders hunched, and his voice reduced to a compliant, exhausted murmur. He moved sluggishly through the house, offering short, agreeable responses to Monica's sharp commands. We moved into the formal dining room, sitting around the long mahogany table beneath the glowing crystal chandelier. The atmosphere was incredibly thick with unspoken tension and hidden agendas. Cynthia served a lavish roast, pouring wine and dominating the conversation with trivial, meaningless gossip about her prestigious charity boards. Monica sat directly across from Derek, her sharp eyes tracking his every movement like a hawk watching a wounded rabbit. She was meticulously assessing his mental state, ensuring the elevated dosage of the poison was effectively destroying his capacity to resist. Derek chewed his food slowly, staring blankly at his plate. When Cynthia politely asked him about his upcoming work week, Derek let out a long, shuddering sigh. He looked across the table at Monica with a perfectly manufactured expression of profound defeat. Derek spoke in a quiet, submissive tone, completely devoid of any fight or independence. He told Monica that he was entirely exhausted from the corporate pressures. He stated that he had reviewed the new binding legal documents she had drafted regarding his estate planning and corporate voting shares. He looked her directly in the eyes and promised that he would sign everything the very first thing tomorrow morning. He claimed he just wanted the paperwork finalized so he could finally rest without the constant anxiety of managing his portfolio. Monica's face instantly relaxed into a look of predatory triumph. She reached across the polished wood table and squeezed Derek's hand, offering a sickeningly sweet smile while praising him for making such a mature decision. The dinner concluded with a disturbing display of false familial harmony. Cynthia and Monica cleared the plates, moving toward the kitchen, while Derek and I remained seated at the grand table. I watched the two women stand by the marble countertops through the open archway. Cynthia turned slightly, catching Monica's eye. The two women exchanged a brief, silent, and deeply triumphant glance. It was a look of absolute victory. They believed their meticulous master plan was completely secure. They believed they had successfully lobotomized my son and fatally poisoned my mind. They believed tomorrow morning would bring them a massive fortune and total control of a corporate empire. I remained seated in my heavy oak chair, my posture slouched in feigned exhaustion. I slowly lifted a linen napkin from my lap and carefully wiped the corners of my mouth. As the thick fabric covered my face, shielding my expression from the kitchen, I allowed a dark, lethal, and purely predatory smile to finally break across my features. They thought they were the brilliant architects of my absolute demise, but they were simply walking into a reinforced steel cage that I had already locked and sealed. The weekend passed with an agonizing, almost suffocating slowness. But Monday morning finally arrived, crisp, cold, and heavy with impending consequence. I woke up long before dawn, completely abandoning the fabricated routine of the weary, declining old man. I did not shuffle sluggishly down the hallway. I did not take the time to brew my usual poisoned herbal tea. Instead, I stood under a scalding shower, letting the blistering water wash away the final remnants of my manufactured frailty. I shaved with meticulous, deliberate care, staring into the mirror at a reflection that had completely regained its former razor-sharp intensity. I bypassed my casual weekend attire and purposefully selected my sharpest, most intimidating tailored navy suit. It was the exact suit I exclusively reserved for ruthless boardroom battles and hostile corporate acquisitions. I secured a heavy silk tie and polished my leather shoes until they gleamed. I left my massive estate hours before Cynthia or Monica even stirred in their respective beds, slipping silently out through the underground garage and driving directly to my private downtown office to meet Bradley and Victor. At exactly 9 o'clock, the atmosphere inside the main executive boardroom on the 50th floor of my corporate headquarters was remarkably tense. I did not enter immediately. Instead, I stood silently in the adjacent glass-enclosed observation room, watching the live security feed monitor the massive space. The long, polished mahogany table was completely surrounded by my senior directors. They were a fiercely pragmatic, deeply loyal group of men and women who had spent decades helping me construct my empire from the ground up. They sat in highly uncomfortable silence, murmuring among themselves, completely unaware of the explosive, life-altering theatrics about to violently unfold. Right on schedule, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with an authoritative thud. Monica strode confidently into the room, radiating an aura of absolute sickening entitlement. She was dressed in a sharp slate-gray designer suit, actively projecting the polished image of a seasoned corporate executive, rather than the desperate, heavily indebted street grifter she truly was. Cynthia walked closely by her side, clutching a designer handbag and wearing a somber, meticulously manufactured expression of profound, inescapable grief. She was perfectly playing the role of the tragic, long-suffering wife burdened by tragedy. Derek was noticeably absent from the procession. He remained safely hidden away in the secure medical facility where I had sequestered him yesterday, completely insulated from the upcoming massacre. Monica confidently marched directly to the head of the long table, boldly claiming the seat, traditionally reserved strictly for the corporate chairman. She placed an exquisite imported leather briefcase onto the polished wood, snapped open the golden clasps, and dramatically withdrew a thick, imposing stack of legal documents. She stood tall, looked down at the bewildered board of directors, and loudly announced that she was attending this emergency meeting, acting as the sole legally binding proxy for my only son. With a calm, highly practiced cadence, Monica placed the freshly signed, heavily notarized share transfer documents directly onto the center of the table. She loudly declared that Derek had permanently relinquished his 40% voting rights into her absolute, unquestionable control. A sudden wave of shocked, chaotic whispers immediately rippled through the seated executives. The loyal men and women who knew my family looked at each other in sheer disbelief, completely blindsided by this aggressive, unprecedented legal maneuver. Monica raised her hand to instantly silence the murmuring room. She stood perfectly straight, projecting total authority. She stated with feigned theatrical solemnity that she was officially requesting an immediate binding motion to permanently remove me from my established position as the Chief Executive Officer. Cynthia immediately stepped forward to support the devastating coup. My wife pulled a separate, thick manila folder from her designer handbag and addressed the shocked corporate executives. She forced a single, highly artificial tear to roll down her powdered cheek, playing the grieving spouse to absolute perfection. Cynthia presented a series of forged, highly sophisticated medical evaluations. She claimed with chilling, unwavering conviction that my cognitive decline had rapidly and irreversibly accelerated over the past weekend. She insisted that I was currently wandering the hallways of our isolated estate in a state of severe, terrifying dementia. She told the silent room that I was entirely incapable of managing my own basic daily needs, let alone effectively running a massive multi-million-dollar commercial real estate portfolio. The directors stared at the medical documents, their faces pale with profound concern and lingering, uncomfortable doubt. Monica leaned aggressively forward, placing her hands flat onto the cold mahogany table. She forcefully demanded that the board execute an immediate emergency liquidation of our primary commercial assets to permanently secure the company against my supposed erratic, destructive behavior. She had flawlessly delivered her ambush, standing triumphantly at the absolute summit of her calculated victory. She believed she had successfully stolen an empire without shedding a single drop of blood. That was the exact moment I reached out and firmly grasped the heavy brass handles of the primary boardroom doors. I pushed them open with a massive echoing crash that instantly silenced every single whisper in the expansive room. I stepped forcefully over the threshold, my posture completely rigid, my spine perfectly straight, and my head held incredibly high. The exhausted, shuffling, severely compromised old man they had left at the dinner table the night before had entirely vanished from existence. I walked into the bright room with the commanding, deeply lethal presence of an apex predator who had just successfully cornered his unsuspecting prey. The sheer shock of my sudden appearance sucked all the oxygen straight out of the room. Bradley walked immediately behind my right shoulder, tightly clutching the original corporate charter and my heavily verified undeniable toxicology reports. Victor stepped in close behind my left shoulder, carrying the massive dossiers detailing Monica's vast, undeniable criminal history and Cynthia's massive offshore financial embezzlement. Two heavily armed, uniformed police officers trailed closely behind them, their hands resting cautiously on their black duty belts, immediately moving to secure the only exit. I walked slowly, deliberately down the length of the silent boardroom, my heavy footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The arrogant, triumphant smile on Monica's face instantly faltered rapidly, melting into an expression of absolute, paralyzing horror. She took a stumbling step backward, her eyes darting frantically toward the locked doors. Cynthia gasped audibly, her trembling hands flying to cover her open mouth as the color completely drained from her perfectly powdered face. She looked at me as if she were staring at a resurrected ghost. The absolute silence in the boardroom was now completely deafening. The board members simply watched in utter fascination as my very existence entirely destroyed their intricate web of highly coordinated toxic lies. I did not blink as I finally delivered the lethal blow to their incredibly short-lived victory. I stopped directly at the head of the table, looking down at the two incredibly wicked women who had actively tried to murder my soul. I leaned in close, my voice a quiet, terrifying rumble. "I believe you ladies are sitting in my chair." The words hung in the chilled air of the corporate boardroom, striking the mahogany table with the force of a physical blow. Monica stumbled backward from the leather executive chair, her manicured hands trembling so violently that the gold bracelets on her wrists clattered against each other. Her meticulously crafted mask of aristocratic confidence shattered into jagged pieces of raw, unadulterated panic. Cynthia remained absolutely frozen. Her mouth opened and closed in rapid, shallow breaths, incapable of forming a single coherent syllable. The loyal directors seated around the perimeter of the room stared at me in stunned silence. They had spent the entire morning listening to a fabricated tale of my cognitive decline, only to suddenly witness me standing before them with absolute lethal clarity. I did not raise my voice, nor did I rush my movements. I walked calmly toward the head of the table, forcing Monica to retreat another 3 steps until her back hit the heavy glass paneling of the presentation screen. I took my rightful seat at the head of the empire I had built with my own 2 hands, placing my palms flat against the cool, polished wood. Monica scrambled to recover her shattered composure. She lunged toward the stack of legal documents resting on the center of the table, her voice pitching into a desperate shriek. She wildly declared that the meeting had already commenced, that she held the binding proxy for my only son, and that the executive board was obligated to process the transfer of the commercial voting shares. She waved the notarized papers in the air, like a shield, aggressively demanding that the directors recognize her authority. I did not grant her the dignity of a direct response. Instead, I gave a brief nod to Bradley. My attorney stepped forward, his heavy leather briefcase snapping open with a sharp, terrifying click that echoed loudly through the silent room. He withdrew the ancient corporate charter, his voice booming across the boardroom, with unwavering professional authority. Bradley recited the specific legal parameters of the founder's absolute veto. He explained to the breathless executives that as the sole architect of this commercial real estate empire, I retained the permanent power to instantly nullify any executive share transfer upon the mere suspicion of hostile coercion or internal fraud. He officially declared that all of Monica's drafted documents, along with Derek's forced signature, were completely worthless scraps of paper. The color drained from Monica's face. She opened her mouth to scream an objection, but Bradley was nowhere near finished dismantling her fragile illusions. He reached into his thick leather folder and threw the certified laboratory toxicology reports directly onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy packets slid across the polished surface, stopping inches from Cynthia's trembling hands. Bradley addressed the board of directors with a cold, unforgiving precision. He announced that those medical files contained undeniable, scientifically verified evidence of systemic poisoning. He detailed the high concentrations of illegal synthetic neurodepressants that had been intentionally administered to both myself and my son over a sustained period. He pointed a steady, accusing finger directly at the two women standing at the front of the room. The collective gasp from the seated executives was completely deafening. The men and women who had respected me for decades stared at Cynthia with profound, unbridled disgust. They realized the supposed rapid onset dementia was nothing more than a calculated chemical assassination attempt. Cynthia weakly reached out, attempting to touch the medical reports, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. She stammered a pathetic, broken denial, desperately claiming that the laboratories had made a catastrophic error. I finally locked my eyes onto hers, letting the sheer magnitude of my absolute rage burn through the quiet space between us. I told my wife of 40 years that her pathetic masquerade was permanently over. I informed her that I had spent the entire weekend listening to the encrypted audio feed from the hidden microphones in our own living room. I told her I heard every single word of her extortion, every chilling detail of her $8 million offshore Ponzi scheme disaster, and every single dark instruction she gave to chemically lobotomize our only child. Cynthia collapsed into the adjacent leather chair, her body folding inward as the crushing weight of her inescapable reality crashed down upon her shoulders. Monica, however, possessed the primal instincts of a cornered animal. Realizing that the corporate takeover was completely destroyed and the poisoning plot was entirely exposed, she made a sudden frantic dash toward the heavy double doors. She shoved her shoulder aggressively against the polished wood, desperately trying to escape the boardroom. I raised my right hand, signaling the two uniformed police officers waiting quietly by the entrance. The officers stepped forward with swift efficiency, blocking her path and grabbing her arms with unyielding force. Monica thrashed violently against their grip, her expensive designer heels kicking wildly at their shins. She screamed that they had no legal right to detain her, wildly demanding to call her phantom corporate lawyers. Victor stepped calmly forward, completely ignoring her chaotic physical outburst. My private investigator handed the lead officer a thick, sealed envelope containing the official federal extradition paperwork. Victor looked directly into Monica's terrified eyes and delivered the final devastating blow. He announced that the officers were not just arresting her for the attempted chemical poisoning of a corporate executive. He stated that they were officially executing multiple active federal warrants for severe wire fraud and massive grand larceny originating directly from the state of Nevada. He casually mentioned the violent illegal gambling syndicate in Las Vegas, loudly confirming that the federal authorities were extremely eager to discuss her $3 million outstanding debt. The sheer terror of that specific revelation completely broke Monica's mind. The flawless, aristocratic persona she had maintained for an entire year instantly dissolved into a vile, terrifying display of primal rage. She began screaming vicious, vulgar curses, spitting venomous insults at everyone in the room as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked sharply around her wrists. The officers roughly dragged her thrashing, screaming body out of the boardroom, her pathetic cries echoing down the long corporate hallway until the elevator doors finally swallowed the sound entirely. The sudden silence that returned to the boardroom was incredibly heavy, thick, with the lingering scent of absolute destruction. I sat quietly at the head of the table. The loyal board members remained completely frozen in their seats, processing the unbelievable magnitude of the violent betrayal they had just witnessed. I turned my head slowly, focusing my cold, unyielding gaze on the only remaining architect of this catastrophic nightmare. Cynthia was left entirely alone. The prestigious socialite who prized her flawless reputation above her own family was now publicly exposed as a ruthless, embezzling monster. She stared at the closed double doors, slowly realizing that her carefully constructed empire of toxic lies had burned to ashes. Cynthia turned to face me, her eyes overflowing with pathetic tears. Her perfectly manicured hands grasped the table. Her voice cracked, reduced to a terrified whisper. She begged to speak with me in private before I completely destroyed everything she had left. I looked down at the trembling woman sitting at the end of the vast mahogany table. Her tear-streaked face was an absolute portrait of pure, unadulterated terror. She pleaded for a private audience, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her immediate ruin. I did not immediately grant her request. Instead, I slowly raised my hand, gesturing to Bradley and the remaining stunned members of the executive board. I instructed them to clear the room firmly, stating that the corporate emergency had been neutralized and that the immediate danger to our portfolio was eliminated. The loyal directors, visibly shaken by the magnitude of the violent betrayal they had just witnessed, silently gathered their belongings. They filed out of the expansive boardroom, without uttering a single word, shooting lingering glances of disgust toward the woman who had attempted to orchestrate a chemical assassination. Bradley was the last executive to leave. Before he stepped through the heavy double doors, he gave me a curt, professional nod of solidarity. As the wooden doors swung shut, the latch engaged with a final click. The massive room was silent save for the pathetic, ragged sound of my wife gasping for air. But we were not alone. I had made one final crucial arrangement for this confrontation. The side door of the boardroom, the discreet entrance reserved for executive catering staff, slowly opened. Derek stepped out from the quiet shadows of the adjacent antechamber. Victor had transported my son from the medical safe house to the corporate headquarters earlier that morning, keeping him insulated until the precise moment his presence was required. Derek looked exhausted, the lingering toxic effects of the neurodepressant still evident in the pale, ashen tone of his skin. However, his eyes were no longer clouded with chemically induced compliance or confusion. They were sharp, burning with an intense, fiery clarity born from heartbreak. Cynthia gasped out loud the moment she saw our only child walk into the bright light of the boardroom. The sight of her son broke the final fragile remnants of her fabricated composure. She scrambled out of the chair, her legs failing to support her weight. Cynthia collapsed onto the hardwood floor, falling onto her hands and knees. She began to weep, sobbing with a visceral intensity that echoed loudly off the glass walls. She crawled forward, reaching out toward the hem of my trousers, pleading with me to listen to her justifications. My wife weaponized our 4 decades of shared history, crying out that she never wanted to hurt us. She claimed that the disastrous offshore investments had started as an innocent mistake. Cynthia wailed that she had panicked, stating the crypto fraudsters had threatened to publicly humiliate her and destroy our pristine social standing if she did not cover the massive losses. She swore that the $8 million embezzlement was merely a misguided attempt to secretly repair the financial damage before I ever discovered her failure. She sobbed, clutching her hands against her chest, begging for my mercy, begging me to remember the loving, devoted family we used to be, before the lies consumed her. I stood motionless, staring down at the pathetic display unfolding at my feet. I felt nothing. No pity, no lingering affection, and no sorrow. Before I could utter a single syllable in response to her tearful confessions, Derek stepped forward. He bypassed me, walking directly toward the weeping woman kneeling on the floor. He stopped just a few feet away, looking down at his mother with an expression of pure disgust. The contempt radiating from his posture was palpable. Cynthia looked up, fresh tears streaming down her face. She reached her trembling hands out toward him, begging her son to understand that she was only trying to protect their legacy. Derek recoiled sharply from her outstretched arms, as if she were a snake preparing to strike. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a fractured, chillingly calm tone that carried the heavy weight of a shattered soul. He looked his mother directly in the eyes and laid out the undeniable brutality of her actions. Derek stated that she had drugged him. He reminded her that he was her own flesh and blood, her only son, the child she was supposed to unconditionally protect from the world. He coldly articulated the profound depravity of her master plan, confirming that she had willfully sold him to a dangerous, indebted monster just to cover up her massive secret gambling debts and offshore financial crimes. He told her she had actively authorized a professional grifter to chemically lobotomize his brain, sacrificing his entire future, his independence, and his basic cognitive function to permanently secure her own selfish manufactured reality. Cynthia covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the quiet void of the room. She curled inward, completely unable to dispute the cold, hard scientific facts of the toxicology reports or the undeniable recorded audio feed of her own vicious extortion plot. She had nothing left to offer, no more elegant lies to spin, and no more social grace to leverage. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, pulling the final heavy stack of meticulously prepared legal documents from the interior pocket of my suit jacket. I did not yell at the woman crying on the floor. I did not need to raise my voice to demonstrate my absolute authority. I looked down at her and spoke in a quiet, chilling whisper that carried the definitive lethal weight of an executioner dropping a heavy blade. I handed the thick papers directly down to her, letting the heavy, undeniable weight of her absolute destruction fall directly into her trembling hands. I calmly explained the exact contents of the legal packet. The first section contained the immediate, non-negotiable divorce filings officially terminating our 40-year marriage and completely severing her from my immense financial empire. The second section was a highly detailed, aggressive civil lawsuit, explicitly demanding the immediate total restitution of the embezzled $8 million, actively targeting every single private account, hidden asset, and personal property she possessed. The final, most devastating document in the heavy stack was a formally filed, fully executed criminal complaint detailing the systematic intentional poisoning via an illegal neurodepressant, formally charging her with attempted murder and severe bodily harm. Cynthia stared at the documents through a blinding veil of terrified tears, realizing the absolute finality of my retaliation. She looked up at me, her chest heaving silently, begging for a final shred of the loving husband she had so casually discarded. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit, my face a mask of cold, unyielding granite. I leaned down slightly, locking my eyes onto hers for the very last time. You didn't panic, Cynthia. You calculated. You killed your husband the exact moment you decided to poison his cup. Now you get to live with the ghost. Talk to my lawyer. I slowly straightened my posture, turned my back on the weeping woman on the floor, and walked out of the boardroom without a single backward glance, leaving her completely alone in the ruins of her completely shattered life. Exactly 30 days have passed since I walked out of that boardroom and left the woman I once loved kneeling in the ashes of her own absolute ruin. The legal machinery I set into motion that morning operated with a cold, mechanical, and entirely unforgiving precision. Cynthia is currently residing in a small, sparsely furnished one-bedroom apartment on the far undesirable edge of the city. She is heavily monitored by a strict court-appointed supervisor who tracks her every single movement. The swift and brutal divorce proceedings stripped her of every single luxury she once believed was her divine, untouchable birthright. The aggressive civil litigation completely liquidated her hidden offshore accounts, fully recovering the $8 million she had systematically embezzled from my portfolio over the past 3 years. She is now awaiting a highly publicized, deeply humiliating criminal trial for the attempted chemical assassination of a corporate executive. She is facing a mandatory minimum sentence that will guarantee she spends her remaining years locked behind reinforced steel doors, completely isolated from the high society she prized above her own family. Monica met an even swifter, much darker, and far more terrifying fate. She was immediately extradited back to the state of Nevada under heavy federal guard. She currently sits in a maximum security federal penitentiary, facing a mountainous stack of severe grand larceny and wire fraud charges. She spends her days terrified of the violent, unforgiving gambling syndicate that is patiently waiting for her eventual release. The toxic, suffocating silence they left behind was initially deafening, but it has slowly, steadily transformed into a profound, lasting, and deeply comforting peace. It was nearing midnight on a quiet Thursday evening. The expansive executive suite on the 50th floor of our downtown corporate headquarters was mostly dark, illuminated only by the warm amber glow of the heavy brass desk lamps. I sat at my massive mahogany desk, carefully reviewing a thick stack of legitimate, highly profitable commercial development contracts. Derek sat directly across from me, his crisp white sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a silver pen moving sharply and decisively across a yellow legal pad. The physical transformation in my son over the past 4 weeks was nothing short of miraculous. The pale, ashen, sickly complexion that had plagued him for a year had completely vanished, replaced by a healthy, vibrant, and energetic color. The violent trembling in his hands had stopped entirely. The lethal synthetic neurodepressant had been thoroughly and completely flushed from our biological systems. It left behind minds that were once again sharp, deeply focused, and entirely unclouded by any chemical manipulation. But the most significant, striking change in Derek was not merely physical. The profound, naive innocence that had made him such an easy, unsuspecting target for his deceptive wife and his calculating mother was gone forever. It had been burned away in the brutal, scorching fire of their absolute betrayal. The man sitting across from me in the quiet office was no longer a compliant, easily manipulated pawn who blindly trusted those closest to him. He moved with a new, quiet, and deeply intimidating authority. He read every single clause of the real estate contracts with a heavy, deeply cynical, and highly critical scrutiny. He aggressively questioned every vague term, ruthlessly challenged every projected financial margin, and demanded absolute, verifiable transparency from all of our corporate vendors. He had learned the hardest, most agonizing lesson a young executive could ever endure, and the immense pain had tempered him into unbreakable, solid steel. I watched him work in the quiet shadows of the office, feeling a sudden, immense wave of absolute, undeniable pride wash over me. I closed the heavy leather folder on my desk and stood up, walking slowly over to the antique crystal wet bar positioned in the far corner of the spacious room. I reached out and took a heavy, faceted decanter filled with deeply aged premium single malt scotch. I picked up 2 heavy crystal glasses, feeling the solid weight of the glass in my hands. I poured the rich amber liquid, slowly watching it splash cleanly against the bottom of the glasses. For the first time in over a year, I did not need to constantly monitor the room for hidden threats. I did not need to execute any elaborate sleight of hand, nor did I need to palm a hidden sponge to protect my own life from the woman brewing my tea. The drink I was pouring was pure, entirely untampered, and completely free of any lethal deception. I carried the 2 glasses across the thick, sound-absorbing carpet and handed one directly to my son. Derek stopped writing, placed his silver pen down onto the legal pad, and looked up at me. He took the heavy crystal glass, his eyes meeting mine with a deep, silent, and incredibly profound understanding. We did not offer a loud, boastful toast to our vast financial success. We did not raise our glasses to the millions of dollars we had secured, or the massive real estate acquisitions we were currently planning to execute in the next quarter. We simply raised our glasses to our mutual, hard-fought survival. I took a slow, burning sip of the scotch, letting the intense warmth spread smoothly through my chest. I looked at the strong young man sitting across the desk and realized a profound, life-altering truth. I had lost a wife of 40 years, and I had lost the comfortable, comforting illusion of a perfect, loyal family. However, through the fire and the ashes of that destruction, I had finally gained a true, formidable, and utterly ruthless partner. I knew with absolute unwavering certainty that when the day finally came for me to step down and walk away from the business, this massive corporate empire would be left in incredibly capable, fiercely protected hands. Derek took a long drink from his glass, offering a small, genuine smile that finally reached his eyes and softened his harsh features. He thanked me, his voice thick with emotion, not just for the drink, but for saving his life when he was too blind, too trusting, and too chemically subdued to see the sharp blade resting directly against his throat. I placed a steady, reassuring hand on his shoulder, telling him that the past was officially dead and permanently buried. I told him we were moving forward stronger, faster, and significantly more vigilant than we had ever been before. I turned away from the heavy wooden desk and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining the far wall of the executive suite. I stood in the quiet, comforting darkness, looking out over the sprawling, glittering skyline of the city. The brilliant city lights stretched out for miles in every direction, a vast, glowing ocean of steel glass and concrete that I had spent my entire adult life conquering and claiming as my own. The empire stood permanently fortified by a brutal lesson in trust. The predators were locked away, leaving us to rule completely without fear. I took one final sip of scotch. The war was officially over, and our legacy was perfectly secure. The days that followed our silent toast in the executive suite unfolded with a remarkably steady, predictable rhythm. The immediate explosive shockwaves of the boardroom confrontation gradually subsided, leaving behind a completely altered landscape. The notoriously fickle, highly insulated high society of Denver functioned exactly as I had always anticipated. The scandalous whispers spread through country clubs and charity galas like a raging, uncontrollable wildfire. The wealthy elite, the very people who had warmly embraced Cynthia and eagerly consumed her meticulously crafted tales of my tragic cognitive decline, instantly turned their backs on her. They feasted on the salacious details of her sudden catastrophic downfall, loudly condemning the $8 million embezzlement, while completely ignoring their own quiet complicity in her elegant lies. I simply let them talk. I did not issue a single public statement defending my mental acuity, nor did I grant any exclusive interviews to the hungry financial press. I chose to speak entirely through my immediate, undeniable actions. I took absolute, highly visible control of the corporate narrative by personally leading the acquisition of 3 massive downtown commercial properties within a single month. I proved to every single doubting executive, every whispering socialite, and every ambitious rival that old age does not automatically equate to weakness. The ruthless, highly calculated maneuvers sent a chilling, unmistakable message across the entire real estate sector. The aging founder they had eagerly written off was not simply surviving his golden years. He was actively hunting. My daily personal routine experienced an equally profound, completely refreshing shift. Waking up in my sprawling, quiet estate no longer felt like navigating a hostile, heavily booby-trapped minefield. I walked down the grand staircase every single morning without carefully monitoring the ambient sounds of the house or analyzing the hidden motives behind a simple, casual greeting. There were absolutely no more steaming porcelain mugs of special herbal tea waiting for me on a silver tray. There was no longer a need to walk on fragile eggshells around a deeply deceitful, constantly calculating spouse. Instead, I brewed strong, dark, completely untampered coffee enjoying the bitter, honest taste as the sun rose over the distant mountains. The suffocating, manufactured fog of tension had permanently lifted from the vast hallways of my home. Derek and I applied this exact same demand for absolute purity to every single facet of our restored lives. We initiated a massive, thoroughly exhaustive forensic sweep of both the corporate infrastructure and our personal financial holdings. We hired an independent, highly aggressive auditing firm from completely outside the city to review every single vendor contract, every offshore transfer, and every piece of executive compensation dating back 5 full years. We implemented incredibly strict, unyielding protocols requiring dual authentication for any significant capital movement, permanently ensuring that no single individual, regardless of their family name or executive title, could ever siphon funds without triggering an immediate, undeniable alarm. Derek spearheaded this massive operational overhaul with a cold, unforgiving precision that continually impressed me. He had permanently shed the heavy, blinding naivety of his privileged youth, replacing it with the sharp-tempered vigilance of a man who had personally survived a lethal betrayal. As the rigorous audits concluded and the new security protocols firmly settled into place, I found myself thinking about the very beginning of this entire ordeal. I thought about the tiny, seemingly insignificant crack that had ultimately brought down a multi-million-dollar, highly sophisticated criminal conspiracy. Late one rainy Tuesday afternoon, I instructed my private driver to take me across town to a specific, unassuming location. We pulled up to the curb outside the quiet, high-end Italian restaurant where Monica had brazenly conducted her secret extortion meetings. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the heavy glass doors, the familiar scent of garlic and rich marinara sauce greeting me. I did not ask for a table. I stood quietly near the polished mahogany host stand scanning the busy dining room until my eyes found the man I was looking for. Martin, the diligent, highly observant restaurant manager, was briskly moving between tables, ensuring his patrons were perfectly attended to. He was a simple, honest man, working a demanding job, completely unaware that his simple decision to pick up a telephone and report a suspicious conversation had literally saved 2 lives and preserved a massive corporate empire. I did not approach him directly. I did not want to burden him with the dark, heavy, and deeply terrifying realities of the criminal conspiracy he had unwittingly exposed. I simply wanted to acknowledge the profound, immeasurable value of his basic human decency. I walked over to the young hostess standing behind the front register. I handed her a thick, unmarked white envelope and explicitly instructed her to give it directly to Martin at the absolute end of his shift. I told her it was a personal thank you from a very grateful patron. Inside that heavy envelope was a certified check for $50,000. It was a massive, completely anonymous gratuity, a small fraction of the vast wealth he had helped protect. I turned and walked back out into the cool, damp evening air, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. I climbed into the back of my waiting car, watching the glowing restaurant sign fade into the distance as we drove away. One single small act of honesty from a complete stranger had successfully dismantled an incredibly intricate, deeply lethal web of lies. It was a powerful, humbling reminder that even in a world dominated by ruthless greed and dark deception, basic integrity still possessed the undeniable power to change the course of history. I sat back against the smooth leather seat as the car navigated the busy city streets, the bright passing streetlights casting long, rhythmic shadows across the interior cabin. My mind drifted away from the specific details of the shattered boardroom and the echoing sound of the clicking handcuffs. I looked out the tinted window, watching the diverse faces of people walking along the busy sidewalks. Some looked tired, some looked joyful, and some looked lost in their own private worlds. We all navigate this incredibly complex, unpredictable journey called life, desperately hoping the people we choose to hold closest to our hearts are genuinely worthy of our absolute trust. But the brutal, undeniable truth is that the human heart is a dark, incredibly complex labyrinth, and even the most familiar faces can expertly hide the most terrifying, completely destructive monsters. If you are listening to this story right now, I want you to completely absorb the heavy, agonizing lessons I was forced to learn. You must realize blind trust is not a virtue. It is a massive, highly dangerous vulnerability. When the people you love tell you what they are doing, you must verify it. When they present you with documents, you must read every single microscopic line of text. When you notice a sudden, unexplainable change in their behavior, you must never simply dismiss it as a temporary phase or a harmless quirk. You must dig deep, ask the hard questions, and absolutely refuse to accept the convenient, easily digestible lies they eagerly offer you. I am currently 70 years old. In the eyes of society, that is an age typically reserved for quiet reflection, slow decline, and the steady handover of power to the next generation. My wife firmly believed my age made me obsolete. My daughter-in-law aggressively weaponized my advancing years, assuming a graying head equated to a softening mind. They both made a catastrophic miscalculation. They completely forgot that a man who spends his entire life building a massive commercial fortress, brick by heavy brick, does not simply forget how to fight. I do not feel like an old man quietly fading into the background of my own life. I feel entirely reborn. The heavy, suffocating fog that once clouded my daily thoughts has completely dissipated, leaving behind a profound mental clarity that is sharper and far more dangerous than ever before. My mind is entirely my own again. The corporate empire I spent decades cultivating is completely secure, thoroughly purged of the toxic parasites that desperately tried to drain it dry. My home, the sprawling estate that once felt like a lavishly decorated prison cell, is finally quiet. The silence that now fills the grand hallways is not the heavy, tense quiet of unspoken lies or hidden agendas. It is a deeply honest, profoundly truthful silence. I walk through the rooms without looking over my shoulder. I sit in my study without wondering if a hidden camera is tracking my movements. The sheer, unadulterated relief of living in a space completely free of deception is a luxury that no amount of money could ever purchase. Derek comes to visit me every Sunday afternoon. We openly talk about the business, discussing exciting new acquisitions and aggressive market strategies with a newly shared, completely unyielding focus. We do not sit in the formal dining room where Cynthia used to orchestrate her theatrical performances of a loving, devoted matriarch. We usually sit outside on the wide stone patio watching the sunset, paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and dark purple. But more importantly, we talk about life. We openly discuss the agonizing pain of the betrayal we both survived. We do not hide from the ugly truth of what happened in this house. We dissect it, we analyze it, and we use it as a foundational warning for every single decision we make moving forward. Derek is no longer the naive young man who easily fell for a manufactured aristocratic charm. He is a formidable, highly cautious executive who demands absolute verifiable proof before he grants an ounce of trust. I am incredibly proud of the man he has become, tempered by the brutal fire of a deception that would have completely destroyed a weaker individual. We survived the unthinkable. We were systematically poisoned, manipulated, and positioned for a total humiliating slaughter by the two women we loved most in the world. But we did not just survive. We ultimately triumphed because we refused to remain blind to the terrifying reality sitting right across the dinner table. There is a fundamental truth about human nature that most people spend their entire lives actively trying to avoid. We are inherently wired to seek comfort, to crave the gentle illusion of safety, and to deeply desire the comforting warmth of family. We want to believe that the people sharing our homes and our names possess our best interests at heart. We desperately want to believe that loyalty is an absolute unconditional guarantee that comes permanently attached to a marriage certificate or a shared bloodline. But the world is rarely that simple, and human greed is an incredibly powerful, deeply corrupting force. It can easily twist a loving spouse into a calculating predator and transform a charming partner into a ruthless extortionist. The desire to maintain a peaceful household often blinds us to the subtle, creeping signs of profound danger. We constantly excuse the very strange phone calls. We rationalize the sudden, completely unexplained expenses. We blindly and actively dismiss our own deep intuitive warnings, because confronting the ugly truth is far more painful than accepting a very beautifully crafted lie. I allowed myself to be vulnerable because I genuinely believed I was safe within the protective walls of my own creation. I believed my financial success provided an impenetrable shield around my family. I was completely wrong. Vulnerability in itself is not a flaw. It is a necessary, beautiful component of genuine human connection. However, allowing yourself to remain continually exploited simply for the sake of preserving a fake, fragile peace is a massive, fatal mistake. It is an open invitation for total destruction. You must possess the courage to critically examine your own life, to look closely at the people standing right beside you, and to acknowledge the uncomfortable realities they might be desperately trying to hide. When you sense a shifting current, when the pieces of a story do not logically align, you must absolutely refuse to close your eyes. You must actively hunt for the truth, no matter how terrifying the eventual discovery might be. The most dangerous threats rarely arrive with a loud, obvious warning. They do not break down your front door. They quietly slip inside, pour you a cup of tea, and smile sweetly while they carefully orchestrate your absolute demise. You must always remain remarkably vigilant. You must deeply protect your own mind, your massive assets, and your unbroken spirit with an incredibly unyielding, ferocious intensity. By doing this, you will guarantee that absolutely no one can ever steal the magnificent life you have painstakingly built. I stand here tonight, completely victorious, precisely because I ultimately chose brutal reality over a comfortable illusion. I look out over the glowing city skyline one final time, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute accomplishment. The sprawling metropolis below me is filled with millions of complex, intertwining stories, but my narrative is firmly within my own grasp. The bitter ashes of a completely destroyed marriage have successfully fertilized the incredibly strong, permanent roots of an entirely unshakable corporate legacy. I will never allow another deceptive individual to cross my threshold. I have rebuilt my entire world upon a massive foundation of undeniable truth, and this new fortress will forever remain completely impenetrable to any future highly coordinated external attacks. Family is supposed to be your ultimate sanctuary, but marriage rings do not guarantee loyalty. Over 40 years of building an empire, I learned that the most dangerous predators are often sitting at your own dinner table. Trust your instincts. If a perfect situation feels slightly off, it usually is. Never ignore quiet red flags just to maintain a fake peace. True strength isn't merely about accumulating wealth or protecting your children. It is having the unwavering courage to completely tear down your own house when you realize it is built on poison. Justice requires a cold, clear mind. If my story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel immediately. Have you ever discovered a chilling secret about someone you completely trusted? Share your experience in the comments section below. I read every single one. Stay sharp, and I will see you next time.